just want to quickly recap the key points that we saw yesterday. We heard this morning about Walter Kears, that beautiful story about Walter Kears, who said that he came from a family of clergymen and that he was taught to pray more or less before he could walk. That would be very much true of Chadwick. Chadwick came from that sort of background, as we saw yesterday. He was from an Anglo-Catholic family, and I highlighted the three mistakes that his father made in his upbringing, and not beating him enough, encouraging him to think, and bringing him up in a sort of slightly exotic, foreign version of Christianity. Then he went away to a proper school where he was beaten plenty, and had this sort of hardcore religious message drummed into him. He came out of that wanting to be a priest, and then we saw how he went to Oxford and had some sort of crisis of faith.
How long was he there?
At Oxford, 2 years. He arrived in 1909. He should have stayed till 1912. So it would have been a 3-year course, English degree course. He dropped out in 1911, so he didn't stay the course. And then disappeared to Canada, spent some time in the wilderness, as we saw, tramping around. Then it was the First World War, that ghastly experience of shell shock and that trauma. And then we left him at a sort of key moment. It was a cliffhanger, if you like. He got his hands at the end of the war on the Bhagavad Gita, which he said was given to me by a friend. He never revealed who the friend was. I guess it was his university tutor, B.H. Streeter, because Streeter was interested in Eastern religions. He visited India. He wrote about Hinduism and Buddhism, and he described the Bhagavad Gita as the most sublime of the Hindu scriptures. So he'd certainly read it. So my guess is that there's that connection. Okay, so that's where we left him. I'm going to have to condense sort of 15 years of Chadwick's life down to a few seconds. So I'm going to go race through the 1920s. What happened? Chadwick, after the First World War, and I always imagine him holding, or with the Bhagavad Gita in one pocket and a bit of alcohol in the other. He was a heavy drinker, he would have a flask of whiskey or something like that. They carried his two supports, if you like, his two crutches that he carried around with him was his scripture and his alcohol. And so, armed with those things, he set off from Europe and went to South America. He went out there as a bank clerk, which for someone from his class was an unusual thing to do, but he just wanted to travel, obviously. What he did in South America after that is unclear. The key spiritual event after the First World War is that around 1923 he said he started to meditate. But it was a very sort of on-off affair. There are some very advanced souls, and I'm not looking at anyone in the room when I say this, but there are some advanced souls who at the age of 20 or even younger kind of settle down in an ashram and devote themselves full-time to spiritual practice. I'm not one of those people. I'm much more sort of sinful and worldly, and so I was encouraged to discover that Chadwick was the same. Chadwick was not one of those people who at the age of 20 immediately got it and just became a sort of monk, whatever it was. So although he started to meditate in 1923, he thought the only way you can make any progress was to do it absolutely full-time. He thought you'll never make spiritual progress if you're doing a job, if you've got another life to lead. And so he did it for a bit and then he dropped it, and then he did it a bit more and dropped it. He was one of those all or nothing people. And I think that's maybe why he couldn't accept the version of Christianity that was being offered to him, possibly. It was too many compromises, perhaps. Anyway, so he was a sort of ordinary person throughout the 1920s. We know that he got engaged at one point while he was living in South America, and then he broke that off. I don't know why. Another time, later on, he fell very much in love with somebody, and he seems to have been rejected. So this was a sort of ordinary, worldly, if you like, well, not in the very negative sense of that word, but ordinary life in the world, if you like. But all the time, sort of meditating at the same time. By 1935, which is kind of the key date, he had moved. He visited almost every country you can think of, and he eventually ended up in Mallorca, Spanish island. In 1935, he was living there. And by this time, he had decided that the way to make spiritual progress is to go to India and find a guru. That doesn't really narrow it down. India is big and it's not short on gurus, so Chadwick didn't know where he should start. And then under mysterious circumstances, there's no time really to explain, he got his hands on Paul Brunton's A Search in Secret India. I'm sure people are nodding, you know this book. This is a book that encouraged many people in India as well as outside India to go to Arunachala and see Bhagavan.
Do we know how he decided he wanted to go to India? Like what?
I do know. Well, what happened is that he was at a reception in Budapest, which sounds very glamorous, and it probably was. Remember, he had a private income, so he was, living the high life in a way. He was travelling around Europe, and he was at a reception in Budapest, and he said, it suddenly hit me, like a sort of bolt from the blue, what I must do is go to India. He didn't explain it any more than that. As we'll see a bit later, he had mystical experiences that he never shared with anybody. I'm going to explain one of those later. It's very interesting. He kept them secret. So there may have been some kind of vision or something like that. I don't know. As people who've read my book know, he had a brother in India, but he'd never been to visit him. He kind of kept away from India until that point, and then he suddenly decided, that's where I've got to go. And it's as if he realised once he'd gone to India, he'd never come back again. That would be it. Anyway, so it kind of hit him. The moment he saw A Search in Secret India, the moment he read it, and it had a couple of pictures of Bhagavan in it, Chadwick decided, that's it. That's the guy for me. That's where I've got to go. He came to this decision in the spring of 1935. Spring, of course, not a very good time to travel out to India because of the weather and so on. So he went back from Mallorca, where he was living, to England, said goodbye to his sisters. He spent 2 months, he spent the summer in England just saying goodbye. And then, we're coming to it, in the autumn it began the last leg of the great pilgrimage that had taken him all his life. He boarded, a better word, this ship. This very ship, the RMS Orion. She was absolutely brand new. She had just been constructed. Not only that, but she was a ship unlike anything else afloat. She was very, very modern. She had air conditioning, which was unheard of for an English ship. She had sort of modern interiors. This was her maiden voyage. So her first voyage was Chadwick's last. I love all this symbolism. But he didn't know that, of course. That's the important thing. When he got on, he walked up that gangplank. Chadwick had no idea that he was going to be in India for the rest of his life. That was not his intention. He went out there, having discovered this great guru, thinking, well, I'll stay there with him for a while, and I'll make some progress, and I'll come home. It never occurred to him that this was going to be a sort of permanent exile. Okay, remember yesterday I was showing you those notes that he made about his life? We'll just go back to those. The bit I've highlighted there is where he describes his arrival in India. The most momentous day of his life. In a way, there are only 3 important dates in his life, and it's the same for all of us. The day you're born, the day you'll die, and the day you see Bhagavan for the first time. He's actually made a note of the date there. He doesn't usually do that in these notes, but it was so important. It was a sort of second birthday. He noted it down. The 1st of November 1935 was the day he arrived in Tiruvannamalai, stepped into the old hall, and saw the man he was to describe as the wonder of the world.
It's All Saints Day.
Well done, you preempted me like Dennis. It was All Saints Day. Perfect. Chadwick did not do this kind of thing by accident. Chadwick was interested in astrology, and he knew the rhythms of the church's year back to front. He knew all these things. He would have known that this was All Saints Day. This was the day when he, if you like, tried to join or joined the communion of saints with Ramana Maharshi. So I think it's a deliberate bit of symbolism on his part and a sort of communication from him to us about Bhagavan and where he was going and all that sort of thing, but in a Christian context. Beautiful. And it also means he travelled through the night. The boat arrived in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Colombo, exactly. He got the night train. His first journey on mainland India was through the night, and that would have been the night of Halloween. So it's all the ghost is coming back, and that's like, the symbolism is very, very carefully chosen. I feel. Okay, so he's arrived. Of the many, many photographs I could have chosen. Which one is it? Where Bhagavan had his famous shave, we were talking about it this morning. I just chose that. This is a sort of contemporary picture. I think you can imagine.
I have a question. When he saw Bhagavan for the first time, the very first time, was it like floodgates opening,
You're
or was it a
preempting.
very calm?
I'm trying to guess the punchline. Let me get there. We'll get to that. But in a way, this is the first sight of Bhagavan, as we know, the first sight of Aranachala, just as important. Chadwick, in his reminiscences, is not very descriptive. He's not that kind of writer, but when he's describing this day, 25 years later, he does say, "It was a beautiful day at the beginning of winter, and I was immediately struck by the marvellous atmosphere of the place, which you felt you could reach out and touch. It was so potent. It was like a physical, tangible atmosphere. Anyone who's been there will know exactly what he meant. And of course, this is before the cars and the scooters and the auto rickshaws and all that ghastly stuff. It must have been absolutely stupendous experience to arrive there. Like so many people, Bhagavan, Chadwick, took a bullock cart from the station to the gates of the ashram. This is what it looks like today. I don't think it's probably changed much. The tree. What sort of tree does it remind me?
Ilupai.
Ilupai, yeah. The Ilupai tree, which is, you'll have seen it if you've been there, an ancient gnarled tree was still there in those days. And standing underneath the tree on the morning Chadwick arrived at the ashram, went through the gates, was this person, hands up, who recognises him, Ramana Swami. I was saying earlier there are some very advanced souls who get it very early on. Allen Swami was one of those people. He was meditating all night at the age when Chadwick was still sort of probably, drinking and all that sort of thing. And Allen Swami was one of those very advanced souls. He was the ashram builder, as I'm sure you all know, responsible for many of the ashram buildings that we still use today. Now something extraordinary is going to happen, and to understand how extraordinary it is, remember who Chadwick was and remember the situation in India at the time. India was still under British rule. This is a low-caste, humble Indian from a peasant background with very, very little education. He taught himself to read and write, but he was basically, he was down there. Chadwick was up there. Chadwick was an OBE. He was a major. He had a private income, Oxford, public school. If you wanted to create a symbol of British rule in India, you'd have taken 6'2" Chadwick and said, there it is, there's the imperial power, as it were. And what happened? Chadwick walked up to an Allen Swami and fell down at his feet. He prostrated. That was how he began his life in the ashram, with a full-length prostration, not to Bhagavan, but to this humble Indian. This is very, very beautiful, I think, and it's a marvellous expression of who Chadwick was. And it's more than that. Things, I don't know, I can't explain this, I can't really understand it, certainly. Things in Aranachala seem to resonate. Things that happen there are not like ordinary events, they have a wider significance. There's a full symbolism there. It's as if everything arranged, everything has a meaning. And it's impossible not to feel that this prostration somehow has more, it's more than just one man bowing down to another. It's about the English and what they've done and their sins in the country and all that sort of stuff. And I feel that in a way, through him, Chadwick was bowing down to all of you and apologising in a way for what his people had done in the country. It's very, very beautiful. And Allen Swami, not realising all this, was a bit baffled because this very, very tall, impressive Englishman just walked in and fell down in front of him. He reached the logical conclusion which was, he's mistaken me for Bhagavan. You must think I'm the Maharshi. That's what you think. I don't think that's possible. Annamalai Swami at this point was 10 years younger than Chadwick. Bhagavan was 10 years older. So you're mistaking, you're muddling up someone who's 20 years younger. Chadwick had seen those pictures of Bhagavan in Search for Secret India.
Yeah.
He knew he was sort of grey-haired old man and so on. I think he arrived having decided, when I pass through that gate into the ashram, the first thing I will do is bow down before the first ashramite I see. And there you go. That speaks for itself. What a great example, and what a great disciple he was. Further proof that it wasn't a mistake is shown in the fact that he continued prostrating after this. He kept on showing Annamalai Swami an embarrassing amount of respect, kept on bowing down before him. Not only that, Chadwick would ask his servant to take photographs of these prostrations. And you can imagine, if those photographs had turned up in one of the gentlemen's clubs in Calcutta or Bombay, if the other Englishmen had seen this, they would be apoplectic with rage. Talk about letting the side down. This is the one thing you don't do in India when you're trying to rule the place, is bow down in front of a peasant like this. So it's beautiful. Unfortunately, I can't show you those photographs. They've disappeared. I've got one that's very similar though. Check this out. Isn't that beautiful?
And
There.
that's no.
This is one of Bhagavan's attendants. I'm not very good on the names. I think his name Rangaswamy. Yeah, well done.
Does Allen Swami record anywhere, or does David Godman record anywhere that Swami was about?
All these details are from Godman's book, Living by the Words of Bhagavan, which is based on recordings of interviews he did with Annamalai Swami in the 1980s. All these details. Annamalai Swami is one of the people who's closest to Chadwick. He's one of the best sort of sources for information about Chadwick, and it's very good that Godman did those interviews. We've got these fantastic details. So there is Chadwick, our hero, so to speak. What can you say? It's marvellous. Okay, I'm just throwing this in because this is one of my favourite pictures of Chadwick. I feel there's such power there. And again, you know, he's doing this. He's down on one knee. In the Catholic tradition, which he'd been brought up in, you do that before the throne of God, before the altar. And this was his attitude, I think, to the ashram. And that is a very, very beautiful photograph. Okay, so now, on to it. Chadwick has arrived. Annamalai Swami, as best he could, speaking no English, said, I'm not the boss.
Yeah.
The boss is down there, and now I will take you.
There.
I will take you into Bhagavan's presence. So now we're about to join Chadwick, that momentous step over the threshold, as it were, into the old hall, the step that changed his life, the step that he could never step back from. Because once he'd arrived, no matter what intentions he'd come out here with, he was going to be kept here. Two interesting questions. Two interesting questions. The first is, what will his first question be? People who arrived in Bhagavan's presence and asked him a question revealed, as it were, their innermost souls, their preoccupations. And it's an interesting sort of spiritual exercise to wonder, what will I ask? If I got in a time machine and I could go back there and I could see him, what if I could have one question? What I don't know. It's interesting. So we're going to see what Chadwick's first question was. And we're also going to see what his reaction was when he saw Bhagavan. Again, Walter Kears this morning, we saw that when he first set eyes on Bhagavan, he had this sort of extraordinary, heavenly revelation. He saw a light and he thought, this is God in human form, this is it, and all that sort of stuff. Many people, as we know, had similar experiences. There were other people, sort of perhaps more meditative types, who in Bhagavan's presence would have these marvellous, blissful trances and so on, and be lost to the world. So we're going to see where Chadwick is on that spectrum, so to speak. Because there are other people at the other end of the spectrum who felt nothing at all. And they sort of saw a nice old man and couldn't see what all fuss was about. That's no reflection on them. That's just the way it is. It's mysterious. But anyway, it's interesting to see what Chadwick would feel. I feel that in his life till now, Chadwick was like a dog which had lost its master. He'd been wandering around, sort of sniffing around from country to country, knowing there was something missing, never able to put his finger on what that something was. And sometimes I play a game with my dog where I hide behind a tree and watch her. And you can see there's a moment where she thinks, he's gone, and she searches everywhere for me. And I step out from the tree and she's overjoyed. She runs to me with such pleasure and love and excitement. This is what Chadwick is going to experience. He's going to see his master again. So here he is. So the first question is, what did Chadwick feel? And he said, years afterwards, 25 years afterwards and more, when he was writing his reminiscences, Chadwick said, it's difficult to explain. It's difficult to describe my reaction. But it was not like seeing a new person. It was as if he'd always been there, hiding behind a tree. That's my analogy. The master does not desert you. He may hide himself from view sometimes, but he's always there. Chadwick said he'd always been with me, and at this point we should remember what he'd been through. All that Christian stuff, the loss of faith and so on, the sort of belief that it was all over, and then there he is. Marvellous. Bhagavan confirmed it when Bhagavan said, Chadwick was with us before. We've been together before. So Bhagavan had always been there. St. Paul says, very beautifully, it comes out so beautifully in English, this, I don't know why. He says, now we see as through a glass darkly, then we shall see face to face. And I think this was Chadwick's moment. The veil was drawn away and he saw face to face. Marvellous. Okay, the first question. Chadwick's first question, as we know, was asked on the 1st of November. But if you read talks with Ramana Maharshi, that question actually appears on the 6th of November, a few days afterwards. So things are kind of muddled up a bit. But following the chronology in talks is Bhagavan who speaks first. It's Bhagavan who broaches the big subject. As you all know, I'm sure, Bhagavan could see straight into you and he knew exactly what you needed to hear. He gave you exactly the sort of spiritual food you needed from him. So the first words he said to Chadwick sort of indicate what Bhagavan saw in Chadwick's soul. Very interesting. And we also heard this morning that lovely piece by Arthur Osborne. Bhagavan didn't write anything down, he taught in silence, all that sort of stuff. So using the magic of special effects, I have subtitled this picture so you can just read Bhagavan's first ever spiritual words to Chadwick as following talks, and bask for a moment in his silence. Isn't that something? Talks introduces that by saying the Master gave the true significance of the Christian religion thus, and then it's that Christ is the ego, the cross is the body. When the ego is crucified, self-realization. Working on the assumption this was the thing that Chadwick most needed to hear, it seems to me that what Bhagavan is doing here is he's kind of initiating him into the quest for the self, the last sort of stage of his spiritual journey, but doing it in a Christian context. Gracious, merciful, as he always was. He framed it in those Christian terms. That's lovely. And then we come on to Chadwick's first question, and we're back with this. Easter. I was going to say, sorry, Bhagavan's first statement to Chadwick, I don't know if we'll get time, it depends when Dennis stops me. If I get time to try and describe Chadwick's last moments, which I may not do, those first words Bhagavan spoke, the first thing he said was about resurrection, about Easter, this central mystery. And that was a sort of prediction of Chadwick's last moments. Chadwick's first question was about this, so we're very much in the same sort of area. Remember yesterday how I said at university, Chadwick came into contact with Streeter, this radical theologian, who said, what you need to understand about Christ is that he believed the world was going to end. We know he was wrong and all that sort of stuff, so therefore how can he be the Son of God, etc., etc. And on the cross, Christ, when he apparently, perhaps, realised what a terrible mistake he'd made, this great cry came out of him, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Streeter, Chadwick's tutor, says, those words on Christ's lips make us question not only whether Christ was the Son of God, but whether God exists at all. I'm sure Chadwick read that book when Streeter had written it, and any Christian reading it is shaken, especially as this was written by a priest. My God, why have you forsaken me? So that was Chadwick's first ever question to Bhagavan, going right back to university, his crisis of faith and all that. This was still haunting him, this cry, and he said, why did Jesus cry out, my God, whilst being crucified? And this is interesting. I mean, this, for a Christian theologian, this is perhaps the ultimate stumper. You'd be hard-pressed to come up with a good explanation of this one. It's very, very difficult. And yet here is Chadwick, from a Christian background, Oxford educated and so on. He comes to India and he asks Ramana Maharshi to explain this central Christian mystery, which again tells you something about what he'd already understood about Bhagavan's greatness. There's no time, unfortunately, to put up long subtitles about this. It was quite an involved answer, the next one. Basically, what Bhagavan said was, it makes no difference what you think a jnani is suffering as he dies. What you see makes no difference. Some of them die in great pain, some of them go into samadhi, whatever it is. Various things happen to them, but that's only for the onlookers. The jnani himself, all jnanis, are always in the same state. That's the answer. He says that with reference to Christ. So again, behind that, there's a sort of reassurance. He's saying, don't worry, forget all that modern sceptical stuff. Yes, Jesus was a jnani, and I'm confirming it. And the reason I can confirm it is because I'm one too, or else he wouldn't have the authority to say it. So you can take that from him only if you accept his own state, as it were. And I said yesterday that Chadwick was a bit like a child who'd been brought up to believe in unicorns, and then at university somebody came up and said, hang on, unicorns don't exist, modern science proves all that to be nonsense, and now he's in the presence of one. There he is. You can't really deny it. That Jesus talked about having eyes to see. If you have eyes to see, you know what you're looking at in this photograph, and it changes everything. It changes your perspective on everything. So that's amazing. The conversation went on, and I'd spend all day talking about this, just this first conversation. Chadwick then asked about the conversion of St. Paul. He asked, Bhagavan talked about the Trinity. It was all about Christianity, as you'd expect from what we saw yesterday. And it was all the same reassurance. It was all the same reassurance, which is that you're not betraying your background, you're not betraying your father, any of that sort of stuff. What you're doing here, following me, is the essence of Christianity. That's the kind of reassurance. And it's summed up, I'll just give you one last phrase from that conversation. It's summed up in this marvellous phrase. If you want Christ consciousness, you must reach self-realization. To do self-inquiry is to seek Christ. So he's putting it all Chadwick's background And he's saying what you've come here to do is to fulfill your Christian heritage, not to betray it. And I think Chadwick, to me, is more than just another disciple. To me, after all he'd been through, after all he'd suffered, he's the perfect symbol of the West. He'd been through the war, he'd been through that crisis of faith. In him we sort of see the modern problem of Christianity in human form. And after 45 years of trouble and doubt and wandering, he arrived in the old hall sort of tattered and woebegone. And the interesting thing is that Bhagavan talked to him all morning, in English. When Brunson went, Bhagavan said a few words in English and then switched to an interpreter. For Chadwick, he spoke all morning in English. This may stand as the longest English conversation Bhagavan ever conducted, and I think it's because Chadwick is kind of speaking to the West through Chadwick and saying, don't worry, this is the way. This is the solution to your great problem, as it were. So what can I say? It's all pretty marvellous stuff. After this, Chadwick moved into a large room in the ashram that he shared with Anamai Swami, who we saw at the beginning. And Bhagavan would often get into the habit of dropping into that room on his morning walk to say hello to Chadwick. Chadwick, as we've seen, was completely relaxed in Bhagavan's presence. He felt they'd always been together. For that reason, he didn't even stand up when Bhagavan came into the room. He was so relaxed in his presence. When Bhagavan entered his room, he would not even stand up, which is extraordinary. And it seemed to the Indians to exhibit a great lack of respect. But of course, we know that nobody could be more devoted to Bhagavan than Chadwick. It's very strange. But Bhagavan loved him. Of course, Bhagavan did not want to be revered as a divinity, which was his fate. That's not what he wanted, though. He wanted to be one of the gang, as it were. He wanted to be a normal person, just treated in a normal way. And he responded very well when people were relaxed in his presence. Because Chadwick didn't stand up, Bhagavan sat down and chatted. And he would even, in a sort of innocent, childlike way, pick up Chadwick's wallet and start going through it and saying, what's this, what's this? Because he was completely childlike, he was completely innocent. He'd lived his whole adult life in the small circle of Arunachala. He didn't know Chadwick was the most well-travelled, urbane, sophisticated person you can imagine. Bhagavan was the most naive and childlike person you can imagine. It's a marvellous meeting of two different worlds. And here's a picture, an English artist has done with it. I don't know who she is, but I love this picture. I think you kind of see there Chadwick struggling in a way, thinking. He's a thinker. You know, he's got problems. Bhagavan there, looking through his pocketbook, childlike. I don't know what's going on. Who are you? It's marvellous. It's beautiful. One of the questions I said yesterday that perplexed Chadwick when he was young at university was that if the Old Testament is all untrue, or if a lot of it is false, and Jesus believed it, presumably Jesus believed in the book of Genesis, for example, as a first century Jew, therefore he harboured false beliefs. His knowledge was circumscribed, Freudian slip, circumscribed by the... should not mention that, Jews and Jesus was circumcised, and he was also circumscribed. You'll never forget that one. His knowledge, circumscribed. I'll never say it again properly. Limited. His knowledge was limited by the horizons of his day. How could he therefore be omniscient? How could he be God in human form if he made these mistakes? And here Chadwick was seeing it. The mystery was not explained, but it was played out before him. Bhagavan was a divine being, and he knew everything there was to know, but he didn't know what was in Chadwick's wallet. So he was, on one level, completely ignorant, and we all know more than Bhagavan knew about the world, and with modern science we know things he couldn't even have dreamed of, about computers and the internet and all that sort of stuff. And yet, he was infinitely wise. He was sort of pure light, pure knowledge. So that was the sort of mystery of the incarnation, if you like, taking shape before Chadwick. This is the only picture of them alone together. It's a bit blurred, But the look on Chadwick's face is just
Yeah.
fantastic. It's as if, I don't know, he's seen the future somehow. That's just marvellous, that. And of course, as a Christian, I always think of the prodigal son as returned to his father's feet and all that sort of stuff. After all those years of wandering. It's beautiful, beautiful. Anyway. There you see them sitting on Aranatula. Now I'm going to introduce a story about Aranatula. And I'm going to do it in a very, very roundabout way, which will take a lot of time. I apologise. Chadwick's youngest sister, Enid, was an artist. And being an artist, she was obviously a religious artist. And she's still quite well known in England as someone who painted churches and shrines. There are fascinating parallels between her life and Chadwick's. And now, surprise, surprise, this is one of her pictures. These pictures I've been showing you were actually painted by Chadwick's younger sister for children's books. She did children's books to instruct children in the faith in which she'd been brought up, the Catholic faith. And so this one is perhaps, I feel, very close to Chadwick's own childhood imaginings of Christ and the resurrection and Easter. These were his sort of first conceptions. Very beautiful. And now I'll show you a picture of Enid. This is Enid Chadwick, who lived much longer than the other brothers and sisters, didn't die till the 1980s. She loved animals. She didn't have much time for everybody else, apparently. She was meant to have been quite hard, quite tough, a bit of a snob even. And I always used to, when I was writing about Chadwick, used to wonder what would she have made of her brothers bowing down before an Amalai Swami, traditional conservative Englishwoman. And what would she have made as a Catholic of his adopting Hinduism, vibhuti, white robes and all that. Horror, horror. And I thought, she reminds me of my grandmother, and I sometimes torment myself, wondering what would my grandmother think, who I loved enormously, what would she think if she could see me today? I mean, I just don't know, I can't imagine. And I used to kind of, so I wrote in the book, I wrote a chapter saying she would have been horrified if she'd known, and what a pity, she loved animals, but she didn't go to see the great saint whose relationship with animals was unlike anything since St. Francis of Assisi. Her brother must have told her about Bhagavan, but she was so narrow and blinkered and conventional and hidebound that she just stayed in England painting her churches. I wrote this sort of rude thing about her. I'd hardly put down my pen when a couple of days later I was contacted to say that her scrapbook had surfaced unexpectedly, mysteriously, after 25 years. And I kind of felt she was saying, now, if you think that about me, have a look at this. This is what was inside her scrapbook. She kept it. In conservative England, she kept articles that Chadwick had sent back about the Maharshi. She never told any of her Catholic friends my brother's is an ashram. She certainly never showed them any of this sort of stuff. But I think if she was really horrified, she would have thrown it away. She wasn't horrified. She was
What paper is that from? Time.
Sunday Times of India. This is written by Chadwick.
Could you?
Chadwick's article.
Yeah, it's one of Chadwick's articles.
Could you kind of read the title of the article? I can't.
In the hallowed presence of Maharshi,
Oh, I
a
see.
never to be forgotten experience, the coming Jayanti festival. And then there's that description of how Chadwick often commented on this, how on special occasions, big public occasions, some sort of reserve of force would come out of Bhagavan and he'd suddenly be like a king on a state occasion. His great power, and he describes that there, how he sat with his fan.
So what year is that?
1948. And there's a little bit of philosophy there as well on self-realisation. That's a quote from Bhagavan. Digressing, we're going to run over time. This is interesting though. At Enid's funeral, Chadwick's sister's funeral, the priest who gave her oration, who obviously knew her very well, said that in her last years, her method of prayer had become a matter just of not praying, but resting silently in the presence of God. Self-inquiry to you and me. And I think that proves there's this sort of connection between them.
You know, in the Golden Jubilee, there's an article by Chadwick, and it's about to just being.
Yeah.
He may have conveyed that.
Exactly. What I wanted to find most of all when I started the research was their letters. I didn't manage it. But I found this, and it's a sort of symbol that even in Christianity, you can have a place in your heart for Bhagavan, and you can follow his teachings. There's a curtain here, and on the other side of the curtain, there's a Christian, a Catholic church. There's an altar in there. This curtain can be drawn apart at any time. It's all the same room. I didn't make that up. It's a marvellous symbol. This is all a very, very roundabout way. I say, ages and ages ago, before I got diverted, we saw Bhagavan and Chadwick sitting on our ashram. Chadwick, like so many people, got into the habit of going round the hill, encouraged by Bhagavan, who would have told him what a marvellous spiritual practice it was. And in Enid Chadwick's scrapbook, there is an article that describes a mysterious experience that Chadwick had going around the hill. Now, this is interesting because Chadwick never talked about his mystical experiences, and you would not have known he had any. He had the idea that you should keep these things very much to yourself, which is a pity. I mean, it was his humility, but it's a nuisance. Because it would be so interesting to know what these marvellous experiences were. I mean, if Walter Kears had that attitude, we'd never have had that marvellous reading this morning. If something like that happened to Chadwick, he would never have said a word about it. He'd just have kept it himself and carried on. But he was asked to write an anonymous article. And under the cloak of anonymity, he revealed one of his experiences. And you would not perhaps have known it had been written by Chadwick if it hadn't been kept in his sister's scrapbook. Once you make the connection, it's got his fingerprints all over it. How Maharshi helped his devotees, that voice from the hill. Okay, so this is the sort of thing that happens to some people in our ashram. Chadwick started off on production as walking around the hill, and he set off in a very good mood. And he said, I was sure in my heart that I had surrendered to Sri Bhagavan. So he was a sort of spiritually optimistic mood. Reading between the lines, I think the route he took was he went round, and at the end, as you get to the town, you can go up the hill and go to Skandashram and finish your production in that way. He seems to have gone that route. And as he was walking up the hill, he saw coming towards him a leper woman who was hideously disfigured. Her nose had fallen off. She had 2 holes in her face where her nose used to be. She had no fingers, she just had stumps. And this monster came up to Chadwick, sort of brandishing her stumps, wanting something to eat. And Chadwick, for all that he had surrendered, as he thought, recoiled. He was horrified, as I'm sure I would have been. He was disgusted, and he couldn't bear any, he was terrified that she would touch him, there'd be some contact between them. So instead of giving her something to eat, he hurried on his way. As he hurried away from her, he heard a voice from the hill. It was Bhagavan's voice. And again, I've just subtitled it, disembodied this time. Please work. So there you kind of have, isn't that beautiful? It's the quintessence of Bhagavan's teachings, spoken by a disembodied voice to Chadwick. Also the quintessence of Christianity. You become a perfect Viking, you'll become a perfect Christian. Love thy neighbour as thyself, meaning love your neighbour because your neighbour is yourself. That's what it means. So to surrender to me is to surrender to everybody. Marvellous, marvellous. And Chadwick, when he heard that, obviously probably a bit surprised, but he said, I regained my poise. He got his nerve back and he did the Christian thing. That's what I love. He did the Christian thing. He went back to the leper woman and gave her the plantains he was carrying and continued on his way. A short time later, he says, I saw myself, and it kind of almost implies some kind of out-of-body experience. I saw myself standing before a tall figure with long white hair and beard, and he was smiling. And I realised it must be a rishi. So I thought I must prostrate, I must bow down before this divine sort of figure. And as he thought that, as he was about to prostrate, the rishi took on the form of the leper woman. And he bowed down before the leper. And then he says, confused but very happy, I continued on my way. It's marvellous. And he says in the article, this set me off on a new path. And of course, being Chadwick, he doesn't say what the new path was. He doesn't give you any more information. But this is a little glimpse into his inner world that you wouldn't otherwise have got. I think he had lots of these mysterious experiences that he never told anyone. There's a bit in the Bible where Jesus cures a leper. You may know this if you've read the Bible, which most of you have. He cures a leper, and he says, now go back, make the offering in the temple, and don't tell anybody what has happened to you. That's interesting. Why would Jesus, who's just cured somebody, say, don't tell anybody? I think the answer Chadwick would have given for the leper's ego. If you go around saying, I've had this great experience, I'm cured, you tend to become more egotistical. Of course, in the Bible, the leper goes running down the hill saying, I'm cured, look what happened. But Chadwick didn't do that. Chadwick always kept these things to himself. And that's just one little glimpse. Okay, I've really got, I'm going to run out of time. This is a lovely photograph. Chadwick became the first person ever allowed to build himself a private dwelling inside the ashram. This is the consecration ceremony. I love this photograph. Dennis showed it to me the first time I was in Arunachala. It's hanging up in Chadwick's cottage today. I love it because partly you can see Bhagavan himself there arrived to bless Chadwick sort of being installed here. It's not often that you see Bhagavan at a party, so to speak. Normally, you either have a very carefully framed portrait of him, or he's in a stage group where he's at the centre, everyone's either sitting or standing around him. This is a sort of snapshot, almost unheard of, a snapshot of Bhagavan in a moment, not of relaxation, that's not the word, but it's unstaged. You can't even see his head, and yet you can see from the body, just the body, he's just different from everyone else in that picture. That always leaps out at me. A sort of religious icon amongst ordinary people. Interesting to note also that Brunton, this is Paul Brunton, his book had attracted Chadwick to India. He was also there. Anyway, the point of all this, there's Chadwick, and that's Chinnaswamy. So the point of it is that group of three, Chadwick was right at the heart of things. Poor old Brunson's sort of over on the fringes, and he, as you may know, fell out with the ashram, had problems with Chinnaswamy and all that sort of thing. Chadwick never did. Chadwick was always at the centre of it. And it's interesting, sort of in recognition of this, after Chadwick
What is
had
that
arrived...
building just to the right of Chadwick's house?
To the left, you mean? Who built that
No,
cottage?
to our
To the
right.
right. Yogi Ramaya already built a cottage there before Chandra.
It was,
Did he?
okay.
That one, Devraj Madhurya didn't build it yet, and who built that one? Aruna, Shanta.
This one?
You know, Chadwick's been doubled in size now.
Yeah, it's been extended.
Yeah.
He's had work done.
And, I'm wondering if
I thought it was the very first cottage, but somebody else had
Yogi
one.
Ramaya's was the first.
I thought it was the first
That's
one.
a little farther away.
Yeah.
And, but that, let me think about it.
That's not the dining hall wasn't made by then. The first then
No.
It's not
the no
It was still the old dining hall.
No, but the dining hall is too far away, you won't see it in this picture.
I don't know.
No, this is another.
Nobody knows. It's not there now, though, is it? That one?
There's one there now.
Is it?
But I thought that was Devraj Madhurya. Okay, go on.
Anyway,
Okay,
to continue. Chadwick moved right into the heart of the ashram, actually within the sort of sacred precincts. And Bhagavan started calling him Father Chadwick. My Father Chadwick. He'd say, where's my Father Chadwick this morning? Think of all we saw yesterday about Chadwick's background. It's very interesting. Chadwick used to have long private conversations with Bhagavan. In the afternoons, he would go to the old hall when all the Indians were having their siesta, and he'd take over from the guy who was pulling Bhagavan's punkah. He'd say, you go away, let me do this. And then imagine that, alone in the old hall all afternoon with Ramana Maharshi, just chatting away. Heaven on earth. And he must have revealed everything about himself in those chats. Bhagavan knew it all. And if you called him Father Chadwick, I think it was partly as a joke about his parents and the priesthood and how he hadn't gone through with it and all that sort of stuff. But also, everything Bhagavan said worked on many levels. And it turned out that Chadwick did have a special sort of priestly role at the heart of the ashram. The fact that white man got this and a Westerner proved something about Bhagavan, I think, and his kind of universality. But he had that role which was revealed after Bhagavan's death. Just a couple more pictures of Chadwick for atmosphere. There's Chadwick outside his cottage, smiling his wonderful smile. And this is my favouriteest favourite. I love this picture. The atmosphere is all there. And the look on Chadwick's face, something solemn. This is not an ordinary Joe. I always feel when I look at this picture, this was someone a bit special. And I always feel very, very jealous. Besides being a bit special, he didn't have to work. I mean, look at him. He had a private income. All he had to do after the age of 45, when he arrived in India, was to devote himself to meditation, spiritual practice, under the greatest possible guide, who was living just a few yards down the path. And that person in the background may well be Chadwick's servant. He engaged a servant after he'd arrived, so he didn't even have to do the cooking or any of that sort of thing. Marvellous life. So I feel very jealous when I see that. And then I always remind myself, oh, but hang on, he's in heaven now. Remember what he went through. Remember the trenches, the crises of faith, the problems. He'd really been through the mill. He'd spent the 20s wandering around as a sort of tramp. He's having his reward now. But by golly, he earned it. And the other thing is, that of course, although it looks all sort of like a bed of roses and milk and honey in that picture, life in India was not that. Life in India, especially if you're a Westerner, was very tough. I'm going to show you a picture now that illustrates that. This is Chadwick trying to sit cross-legged on the floor. That's the best he could do. That's me. That's when I sit cross-legged, that's what happens. My legs will go up like that. It's agony. And you see here, Chadwick's left ankle is digging into the ground. You can put up with that, from my experience, for about a minute if you're really tough, and then you've got to move. So Chadwick had a problem. And the problem was, how do I sit in the old hall and absorb this radiance that I've crossed the world and all that sort of stuff to absorb? And the answer was, as I'm sure most of you know this, a famous meditation belt. Interesting story behind this. In his reminiscences, Chadwick said, I had trouble sitting on the floor, I could never get myself to do it. So I devised for myself a belt that would sustain my legs. And when Bhagavan saw me using this belt, he said, oh yes, my father used to have one of those, but he never used it in public. I wouldn't use that in public myself. That's beautiful that Chadwick is completely unself-conscious. I think it's marvellous, apart from anything else. Bhagavan said, my father used to have one of those, but he never used it in public. But then Sri Ganeshan got from Chadwick the real story, many, many years afterwards, which was what actually happened, was that when he was young, Bhagavan saw his father using one of these strange belts, and years later, when he saw Chadwick sitting before him, struggling with the left ankle trouble, as you could call it, Bhagavan with his own hands made this belt for Chadwick. And then he said, of course, don't tell anybody that I've done this for you, because you can imagine the problems that might ensue. Don't tell anybody. Well, the interesting thing is that even after Bhagavan's death, Chadwick kept that to himself. He kept that secret. He did reveal it to Sri Ganeshan, but he never puts it in his reminiscences. But it's a beautiful symbol. There, with his own hands, so to speak, Bhagavan, he's tied Chadwick up. Some schoolboys once went up to Bhagavan's couch and said, what's he done wrong? Why have you tied him up? Why have you put him in prison? Well, of course, it's imprisonment as a means to liberation. You must be bound to be free. You must surrender for victory. All that sort of stuff. That's a symbol of all that. It's beautiful. It's also a symbol of Chadwick's complete obedience to Bhagavan. There are lots of examples of this. You may know, Chadwick once had a toothache. And because Bhagavan didn't actually say the words, go to the dentist, he didn't go. Unless he got those words, yes, go, he would not go. So he just stayed in the ashram and suffered the toothache. Oh, this is extraordinary. I mean, who has this kind of obedience? Once Bhagavan said to him, there's no harm eating onions, but they do tend to excite the mind. Chadwick went back to his servant and he said to him, don't ever let me see you cooking an onion again. Because Bhagavan said, maybe it's a problem, that was it. He dropped them. So it's a marvellous symbol of his obedience. Okay, now we're coming on to the big trauma. see. Okay. There we go. This is the last page of Chadwick's biographical notes that we've been looking at, and this is the last entry. And as I say, they're divided up into astrological periods. You've got Sun, Mars, and Saturn, June 1940 to 1942. And you see he's filled in a couple of lines for each period, and this one is left blank. So Chadwick always leaves you a mystery. He always leaves you something to ponder over. Why did he get right to the end of this document and then leave it blank? He was writing after 1942. He knew what had happened in these years, and he had the space to fill in the two last lines. But for some reason, he's kind of come up against silence. And now I'm going to show you a very technical map of the political situation in Europe at that time. There it is. The Nazis had swept through Europe, and they were threatening England, and everybody in 1940 was convinced that Hitler was going to invade England and carry all before him. Nobody could resist Hitler, it was quite obvious. All that stood between Hitler and Britain was this strip of water. If you go to Dover and look at France, you can see the buildings on the French coast. So you can virtually see the Nazis waiting to come over and finish you off, as seemed inevitable. Okay, so now Chadwick is having a little bit of a difficulty. Remember, I said yesterday he'd been brought up to believe that your first loyalty is to the King of Heaven, and your second loyalty is to the King of England. The one thing you don't want is for those two kings to start pulling you in different directions, and that is exactly what's happened. The Nazis were poised to invade England, and Chadwick, unless he heard the words from his guru, go back to England and do your bit, would not go. He just sat there. He looks peaceful, but I'm sure he wasn't. Remember when the First World War broke out, he went back to England so quickly, it was a sort of blur. Nobody could have got back more quickly than him. He was the first officer who ever signed up for his regiment. He was the last officer to leave his regiment. Duty, loyalty, these were the key words of his character. And now his country was calling, but his guru didn't say go. So he just sat there. He gave up reading, even before the war broke out. He gave up reading the newspapers because he just couldn't bear it. You know, it was too much for him. And he had problems with the Indians. And you need to understand, I need to tell you, the Indians had a bit of a hard time under the English. The Indians in the First World War, like Chadwick, rushed to do their duty for England. This is a very strange piece of history. You would have thought that colonised people like that, the last thing they'd want to do was serve England. And yet they fought in the First World War in huge numbers, hoping or believing that the good old Brits, with their sense of fair play, would then give them their freedom after the war. So they made the sacrifice, but they didn't get the reward. Damn it, you know. And so by this time, they were a little bit upset. And I don't need to tell you what that must have been like. And they took it out on Chadwick. Chadwick says in his reminiscences, this is a difficult thing. He says, during the war, even the nicest Indians lost no opportunity of telling me you're going to lose, you're finished, and all that sort of stuff. They kind of taunted him about it. Whether it was actually taunting or whether it was just that Chadwick, who was going through this great crisis, was so sensitive that any topic, any mention of the topic, struck him like a bullet, I don't know. But it was hard. He felt everyone was against him in the ashram. He tried to take a vow of silence to avoid these conversations, but Bhagavan said, no, you mustn't do that. So he just had to put up with it. Okay, so it's a difficult time. While Chadwick was sitting there, what's going on in England? This is a slightly romantic depiction of the Battle of Britain, who, as the historians among you will know, Churchill said they were the few to whom so many owed so much. A handful of young, very brave pilots became the saviours of their nation by denying Hitler the air superiority he needed for that crossing of the Channel. So they were doing the great patriotic thing, they were dying, they were being burned alive to stop Hitler entering the country, and while they were doing that, Chadwick was doing this. Where's your loyalty now? This is extremely difficult for Chadwick, I think. It was during this period that Chadwick wrote his poems. and the best known of them is called, get this, to Maharshi Ramana, the merciful master, will you not let me go? And it was during the war, the first part of the war, that he wrote those poems. The poems are kind of despair, saying, I'm stuck here, I'm an exile. In that poem he says to Bhagavan, you're like a drug pusher and I'm like a junkie, and you say I'm free, but I'm not. I just can't get away from you, and I'm stuck here. And meanwhile, England is falling to pieces. So, the King of Heaven and the King of England, pulling Chadwick in different directions. Something had to give, and what gave was Chadwick's health. He didn't die, that's not what that's meant to imply. He felt ill in the summer of 1940. My feeling, and what I want it to be for the symbolism, is that it was during the Battle of Britain, when England had her back against the wall. Chadwick was stricken down with an illness. It was so bad that for 2 weeks he couldn't even get to the old hall to see Bhagavan. So it must have been very, very serious. And symbolic. As I say, things in Arunachala have a kind of symbolism. That story about when Bhagavan saw the dog chasing the squirrel, put his stick down, fell over and broke his collarbone, and the squirrel was saved, that happened when the Japanese fleet was menacing Madras. And the fleet turned away. I don't know what it means, but it's a beautiful symbol. The squirrel, the dog, God intervenes, and the Japanese leave Madras without flattening it. And in the same way, in the summer of 1940, when Britain was collapsing, when Britain's survival hung by a thread, Chadwick was struck down. I think it was probably dysentery. He may have been close to death. I've got no evidence of this, but for 2 weeks, if you've got dysentery in India in the summer, it's no joke. And after 2 weeks, something extraordinary happened, which was that Chadwick, looking up from what he may have thought was his deathbed, looked up one day and saw Bhagavan standing all pictures of Bhagavan are fantastic, but there are some of them which just take your breath away. They talk about grace. Grace in English is a physical thing. It's what ballet dancers and athletes have. That's grace. I just find that extraordinary. Anyway, he looked up and he saw Bhagavan had come to visit him. Remember, on those first visits, Chadwick was so relaxed he didn't even bother standing up. Things are a bit different now. He's had a very hard time. He may think he's close to death. All Chadwick's hair stood on end. He tried to struggle up out of bed to prostrate, but Bhagavan said, no, stay where you are. And I think, as we'll see maybe later, that this image of Bhagavan standing there, I don't think Chadwick saw just an ordinary person. I think this was kind of burned into his consciousness in some way. Anyway, there's that. Anyway, after that visit, Chadwick got better. Whether that's a miracle or just a coincidence depends on your view. He got better. He returned to the old hall, and so there he is again. He hasn't moved. He's gone back to his old position. Meanwhile, realising that the Battle of Britain had been won, turned to the Blitz, the carpet bombing of London. And if the Battle of Britain had been hard for Chadwick, this sort of thing must have been even harder to imagine. This skyline is dear to us all as Englishmen. You can't help it. Even if you hate London, you kind of love it as well. And to imagine it being flattened by the Nazis must have been extremely painful. Big Ben survived. There you see Big Ben surrounded by rubble, as did St Paul's. But look at the devastation. London was in smoking ruins. And for an Englishman, it's like a sort of personal attack. And remember, Chadwick's friends and family were still in the country. His sisters were still there. In danger and so on, and Chadwick couldn't move without the Guru's word, and then become to the most extraordinary fact, I think, in a way, in a worldly sense anyway, of Chadwick's biography. In his reminiscences, he gives a little hint where he just says, during the war, I didn't read the newspapers, but Bhagavan read them. And Bhagavan was always extremely punctilious about informing me when there was anything I needed to do, such as reporting to the British Society, which was in charge of recruiting Britishers. Chadwick says that in his reminiscences. He kind of throws it in, and you read straight past it. I must have read it 3 times and never thought any more of it. It's a typical Chadwickian hint. You've got to stop and look at it, and then you'll see what happened. One day, Bhagwan's reading the paper, and he said, "Hey Chadwick, they say here that all British people have got to report to the British Society." Okay, so what could Chadwick do? He had to report to the British Society. And so word got back to the War Office in London. Major Allen Wentworth Chadwick, OBE, late of the Hampshire Regiment, is sitting in South India meditating when he should possibly be here doing something a bit more useful. You can imagine there wouldn't have been much sympathy for this sort of thing in London. Remember, Chadwick, we saw yesterday, was a pioneer. He built fortifications, he dug trenches. England was expecting to be invaded at any moment. How can you let this guy go on sitting there? So this is it. If Bhagavan is the immovable object, it's about to be hit by the irresistible force. And the irresistible force is the British government calling Chadwick up. Chadwick was summoned back to England to do his bit for the war effort. And you can imagine, now the crisis has come to a head. This is it. There's no way out of this. What's he going to do? How is he going to avoid leaving Bhagavan, which is the last thing he can do? There's the King of Heaven and the King of England. Chadwick is determined to stay with the King of England. Also remember, the King of Heaven, but also remember, the keynotes of Chadwick's personality were loyalty, duty, patriotism. And yet, what did he do? He took the only way out. He renounced his English passport and became an Indian. So, isn't that marvellous? It can't have been an easy decision. I said yesterday, look at him, he looks like a Hindu. And in fact, he actually had an Indian passport at the end. I also told you that he always intended to go home. That was always his plan. He never wanted to stay here all his life. When he met Somerset Maugham in 1938, a couple of years before this, he said, "I'm going to stay in India until either A, I become self-realised, or B, Bhagavan dies. When one of those things happens, I'm off. There's no need for me to stay." But now, he's not a British citizen anymore. Things are not quite so easy. So he's kind of burnt his bridges. And then we come to the next thing. In 1942, and I can date this because it's in the ashram archive, Chadwick wrote a poem. And it ends up, I'll just give you the last verse. And it says, "Oh, Arunachala, my God, with Ramana the same. Slowly upon my way I plod. I can but take thy name." And so Chadwick, and it's signed not by Allen Chadwick, but by Sadhu Arunachala in 1942, having, I think, given up by then his British passport and taken an Indian passport. Chadwick took the name Sadhu Arunachala. So Chadwick himself, Major Chadwick, was finished at that point. That was the end. And so we come to this. Some of you may know, outside his cottage in India, there's a little stone where Chadwick apparently buried his ego. I think he buried something of himself under there, maybe at around that time. And so there, I think that's why those last couple of lines were blank. It was finished. There was nothing more to say. Okay, I'm nearly finished now. Moving swiftly on. Towards the end. The end is closer than Chadwick thinks. Try to put yourself in his position. And we all say, and we all mean, Bhagavan is everything to us. But for Chadwick, it was something else. That was all he had left now, was Bhagavan. And within 8 years of this great crisis and his changing his name, giving up his bottle and everything, Bhagavan was dead. All the devotees were devastated by that. But for Chadwick, it must have been particularly difficult. Chadwick said that he left the ashram never to return. He never intended to come back there again. And I feel it's as if the recollections of Bhagavan were almost too painful in a way. He couldn't bear it. And then he says, "I left never to return, but something drew me back. Whether there was some other mystical experience, or whether it was just his own feeling. Something drew him back there. Again, in the Bible, they say, Christ says, when the shepherd is struck down, the sheep will be scattered. When Balaam died, the sheep scattered in all directions, and Chadwick was one of the first to come back. And so now a very quick look at Chadwick's legacy to the ashram. Dennis will recognise this. This is a picture of a chakra. I'm well off my area of expertise now. This is completely baffling to me. This was drawn by Bhagavan himself, this beautiful picture which shows the perfection that was in everything he did. And I show it to you now because a big part of Chadwick's legacy to the ashram was that when he got back after Bhagavan's death, he had the money, and this cost money. He reinstated the Sri Chakra Pujas in the Mother's Temple, and he himself wrote in an article, the whole ashram rings with the vibrations that these pujas set up. He was deeply immersed in Hindu rituals, as we've seen. He was more Hindu than most Hindus. So he oversaw that, which is a marvellous legacy, and those pujas are still going on today. Bhagavan loved that particular puja. He went out of his way to listen to it. And the other part of Chadwick's legacy is this. There's Chadwick with the boards you may recognise of the Veda Pathasala. Chadwick got that going again. Again, it was a question of money, as much as anything else, and organisation and faith, obviously. But how extraordinary. I mean, how many pictures can you find like that in India of a white man running a Vedic school? This is extraordinary. You don't need me to tell you that the Vedas are a tradition that go back into the dawn of history, an extraordinary oral transmission down the ages, and Chadwick, the Englishman, played his part in it. And of course, the beautiful thing is that life had come full circle. We're back with the Victorian headmaster. Chadwick's destiny as kind of fulfilling itself. I asked yesterday what went wrong. Nothing went wrong. That's the answer. Everything was absolutely perfect. And I feel that Mr. Chadwick's faith, his spirituality, his idealism were not betrayed by Chadwick in India. They were fulfilled. Chadwick stood on the shoulders of this great Christian, and standing on his shoulders, he touched the feet of Bhagavan himself. But if the ashram, as I say, owes Chadwick a debt, it owes him a debt as well. That's beautiful. And now a colour picture. The only one of Chadwick that I think exists, a colour picture of Chadwick. Chadwick was born in the age of the theatre, and he lived through the age of the newsreel. And just as he died, the television age was beginning. This was not his age. He was about to leave the stage, as it were. But it's marvellous that we have that colour picture of him, and it's as if he's suddenly closer to us. At the last moment, you can glimpse him. And it's from this time in his life that we get some of the personal recollections of people who actually knew Chadwick and saw that impressive figure walking around the place. And I think I'll leave you with a recollection that the ashram president gave me. When I was lucky enough to interview the president when I wrote my book, and he said this in a very offhand sort of way, what I'm going to tell you, but it's beautiful. During the 1950s, the sheep were scattered, and Chadwick, as I say, although an Englishman, was one of the first to go back and to start saying, come to the ashram, come back. Not he is risen, but he's still here, like the master, the dog's master, hiding behind a tree. He said, Bhagavan has not disappeared, he's still here. He's hidden himself from you, but come back, he's still here. It was Chadwick who said that. There's a Roman centurion in the Bible, and Jesus says of him, I have not seen such faith even in Israel. Sort of poetic language, but I think it's Jesus' way of saying that's not bad for a Roman. And I think we can say of Chadwick, not bad for an Englishman, a member of the ruling class, all that sort of stuff. Perhaps one of the few people in the branch we can be completely, unashamedly proud of. So he started encouraging people to come back. And in the 1950s, when it was hard going, when it was an uphill struggle. People weren't coming, the ashram was going through series of court cases, there was hardly enough money for a cup of rice sometimes. It was, in some ways, a sort of dismal and depressing time. The ashram president was at university then, and he told me he used to come back from college and go to Bhagavan's shrine, and there'd be one person there. It was Chadwick, and the president told me he would just be sitting there quietly. Chadwick was never one of those people who set himself up as a teacher. He was too wise for that, and yet he teaches us in everything. All his stories are teaching. And I'll leave you with that last teaching. The master had disappeared, but the dog carried on sitting at its master's grave with utter loyalty. And I take that as his message to us. Thank you.
Oh, wow.
Briefly go through his last illness and
I'll try to avoid this.
Go through what?
The death.
last illness.
Last illness.
Okay. You're torturing me now. Okay. What happened was, in 1962, so when he was 72 years old, just before Easter, and remember what I've been saying, Chadwick knew the rhythms of the church year. He always knew whether it was Christmas or Easter or anything in between, all the feast days. He would have been preparing for Easter, I think. He would have been meditating. Perhaps that was when he wrote out those words that Jesus spoke on the cross. He would have been reading his Bible and all that sort of stuff, whilst at the same time listening to the Vedas, participating in the Sri Chakra Pujas and all that. So it was Easter, and just before Easter, Chadwick had to go into hospital for a small operation, a minor procedure, a hernia operation, I think it was. By this time, Sadhvaranatcha, as he then was so attached to the mountain and to the ashram that he refused to leave. People said to him, this operation is quite big, you need to go up to Vellore, to the proper hospital there, have it done properly. Chadwick refused to leave Tiruvannamalai, and so he had his operation done at the little sort of cottage hospital there. A mistake, because once he got back to his room in the ashram, the wound became infected. Chadwick had fought in the First World War, and he knew very well the danger of an infected wound. You would have seen men dying like that, you would have known the symptoms, it would have all been very familiar to him. And so when he started getting hot and fevery and all that sort of stuff, and started seeing the effects of the infection, he would have realised that his life was in danger. But I think, and I'm guessing here, I think Chadwick obviously had been imagining his own death, and I think he imagined it happening in the ashram. I think, and perhaps all of us here would choose, if we could die, we'd do it. Someone died there recently at Bhagavan's shrine. That's where you want to die. That's the perfect death for a devotee. Perhaps you're walking around and you drop dead. That's what you want. I think that's what Chadwick wanted. And his friends said to him, you're dying, you're in a bad way, we've got to get you to the big hospital in Vellore. And he resisted, thus signing his own death warrant. The problem was that you get delirious with blood poisoning. I don't know the whole details of the story, but eventually they persuaded him to get in the car and go to. This is the mission hospital in Vellore where Chadwick died.
Oh, you had to set up.
Yeah, I'm too frightened to start setting that I didn't want to talk about it. I was trying to get away with it, but Dennis has forced me. Yeah, I've got it set up, there it is. That's where Chadwick died. When he was admitted there, the doctor who saw him said to the ashramites who brought him, you brought him very late, which is like sort of signing a death warrant, if you like. There's nothing we can do for this guy. They tried giving him transfusions and so on, but to no avail. Chadwick was admitted into this hospital on the Tuesday of Easter week. Easter being, of course, when Jesus and Ramana Maharshi both died. Christmas being when they were both born. This is a very interesting bit of symbolism, which I would love to talk about more. But it was important to Chadwick. Chadwick knew what Easter meant, all right. Anyway, he was admitted there on the Tuesday of Easter week. By that time he was dying. People from the ashram gathered around his bedside. Mrs. Talyarkan was one. Mrs. Osborne was another. I don't know if Ganeshan made it. I don't think he did. The person who had a part to play in the last scene was a guy called Hugo Mayer, who arrived in the ashram after Bhagavan's death, but was a great yogi and so on, a great practitioner. He was given some lines to speak by the great author, as it were, in this last little drama. So Chadwick lay dying, and he didn't take it well. And I think what unites everyone in this room is death. You know, this is what one thing we've all got in common. Unfortunately, I'm not looking forward to it myself, and I don't think I can't make any bones about that. It's not the prospect I relish. But Chadwick, you would have thought, different level from me. You would have thought he breezed through it, the great yogi, all the meditation, all that sort of stuff. No, and in a way, he's comforting me here as well. He comforted me in the 1920s with the drinking and the women, as it were. I feel a bit better looking at that. And when I look at his last experiences on his deathbed, it gives me hope in a way. Because what happened? He was frightened. He didn't take it well, and they could see he was frightened. And they said to him, "Can't you feel Bhagavan's presence?" And Chadwick said, "Yes." And they said, "Isn't he helping you?" And Chadwick said, "No." Okay. And remember, the cry of despair on the cross. We've come back to that. It all comes around in a huge, beautiful circle. Bhagavan explained, that was Chadwick's first ever question to Bhagavan. Why did Jesus cry out? What did Jesus cry out? He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The implication being, I still believe in God. God is still there, so to speak, but he's not helping me. He's letting me go through his ghastly experience alone. And it's as if when he asked that first question there, some sort of premonition that my death is also going to be difficult and I'm going to be abandoned. And maybe that resonates with all of us. Until you get there, unless you're Bhagavan himself and sort of self-realised, you just can't be sure. And we all lie awake at night at a certain age, I certainly do, thinking, is tonight the night? And how will I take it? And Chadwick didn't take it well, and that gives me great hope. And so they're all standing there at the bedside, and suddenly Chadwick's face lit up. And he said, "Oh, but he's there. He's there at the door, and he's come for me. He's there at the door, and he's come for me." Hugo Mayer, the medical man, the man of science, although he was a yogi, it seems that once he walked into the hospital, he put on his eye hat and became very sceptical. And he said to Chadwick, no, old man, you're delirious. There's nobody there. They all looked round. There was nobody at the door. There was a bottle, one of those medical bottles, hanging at the end of Chadwick's bed. Hugo Mayer said to him, you're looking at that bottle. It's late at night. You're thinking the bottle is a figure, a sort of illuminated figure. Probably there's a light on the bottle. Chadwick said, no, there's a radiant figure at the doorway, a figure full of light, and he's extending his hands to me, and he's calling me to go with him. And after that, Chadwick's breath, the fear went from him, his breathing became quiet and easy, his face was sort of lit up and peaceful. And this is the great hope, this is the great reassurance. Perhaps we will go through that horror, why have you forsaken me? But Bhagavan will not forsake us. He may hide behind a tree, but he'll come out when the time is right. That's what I take from this story. And then Chadwick said, it's Easter. And remember, they're accusing him of being delirious. So Hugo Mayer said to him, no, you're wrong. It's not Easter. Chadwick, supposedly delirious, said, no, I know there are a few days left to go. But for me, today is Easter. I remember that first conversation with Bhagavan, and what Bhagavan first said to Chadwick, I put up silently on the TV there. When the ego is crucified, resurrection. That was the first teaching that Bhagavan ever seems to have given to Chadwick. And isn't it perfect? I mean, you couldn't make it up. I look at this, and every time I look at it, I'm just staggered and astonished by the sort of beauty of it, the symmetry, the fact that that was his last word, and the fact that Bhagavan had predicted it at their very first meeting. And so, being Chadwick, he leaves us with a mystery. Who did he see? Easter suggests it was a Christian figure. But then I remember I was saying when he was ill, and I thought that image had burned itself into his mind. Maybe what he saw standing at the doorway was this figure. And does it make any difference? No. I don't need to tell you that. Even to call him Jesus or Shiva, or whatever you want to call him, is a kind of insult. It's just a projection that we throw at him.
He saw light, which is false.
He saw light.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What day was it? What time?
Easter Tuesday. Or no, it was probably Wednesday by then. I think it was the night of Easter Tuesday.
So one day?
I don't know. It's I haven't been able to find out when they took him away and how long he was in the hospital for. But he had this extraordinary vision.